Hey, everybody, welcome back to today's episode of To Me Time. I am your host, Megan, and on today's episode, I'm going to be continuing the conversation about the nurse practitioner transition into practice, specifically, really speaking for that new grad nurse practitioner. Also, this can go for any nurse practitioner who's also looking at new jobs or maybe just transition to a new job. And in our last video, I kind of discussed that. So, we all know that the transition into practice is really hard, and that is definitely multifactorial. And there are some things that we can control and a lot that we can't control that goes on that contributes to that. But last video we talked about your onboarding process and creating a very smooth onboarding. What I mean by that is having a company that wants you to succeed, that wants you to have a decent onboarding experience as well, that's getting you up to speed. So by the time you're seeing 100% of your patient load, you are not drowning in the amount of work that you need to do because you have spent a month or 2 months perfecting things so that things are going smoothly. So part of not only just seeing patients, but it's about perfecting your time management as well. And I think time management is just really hard to perfect. It is something I think we're all constantly working on. And I believe that we're better at it at certain aspects of our career than other times in our career. And it kind of just depends on what's going on with our clinic as well. Time management does come to play, especially with new providers, because everything's brand new to you. All the patients are also brand new to you. You don't know your patients yet. And sometimes you just have to spend a little bit extra time with them so you feel more organized, so you have a good, succinct history. And you're usually spending more time documenting because you have to. You don't have any prior documentation to go off of. So today I'd like to focus on ways in which you can be successful being time efficient in clinic and not bringing too much work home with you at the end of the day. I think that providers who bring a lot of work home with them, I think it's part of the job. I think it's natural for providers to have to bring work home, but we shouldn't have to, or try your very best to limit that, because I think it can only lead to burnout and create some resentment towards being a provider, because it's really difficult to work really hard during the day and also come home and still have work to do. It's just exhausting. And then you're on call too. So it's people don't realize that when you are a provider and you're seeing patients throughout the day, you are normally scheduled from like 8 to 5 seeing patients with an hour lunch break. And it is very easy for things to go wrong during the day. What I mean by that is your first patient shows up 10 minutes late, and now your whole day kind of snowballs because that patient was late, and say your next patient shows up on time and everybody else shows up on time. Now that's kind of made you behind, and it will make you behind. So even though you have good intentions for your time management, there are many things that can happen, or your patient shows up late and they still ask you to see them, or your late policy for a 20-minute visit is only 15 minutes. That's totally setting you up for failure, and it's not helping you out. But if that's your company's policy, you have to kind of come up with ways in which you can handle that. That patient's going to have to sit and wait, or you can see that patient, but it's likely going to cut into your lunchtime. So it's just, it can be hard. It's not, people also don't realize that it's not just seeing patients throughout the day. You're still doing other things like looking at labs. You're reviewing prior documentation. You're reviewing documentation from specialists. You're filling out paperwork. You're doing surgical consents. You're doing all types of paperwork. You're filling out, patients bring in so much paperwork that you need to fill out too. So it is very time consuming, and having time when you're starting out in your onboarding phase where you can perfect things like your documentation, making things go as smooth as possible, creating really good documents at the beginning so that by the second or third visit, your plan's well formed, your problem list is accurate, things are going smoothly, will help you. Now, at the beginning, you likely will spend time after work documenting, or spend time after work organizing things. I think do a little bit of that, but don't go too crazy, because you also need that time to decompress, especially when you're a new provider. It's going to be a very stressful transitioning phase. And so don't bring too much home if you can help it, but also just know that it's probably going to take a couple of visits where you're going to feel comfortable saying, like, I really understand this patient, or I've really reviewed all the documents. It's just going to take more than one visit most of the time. So let's talk a little bit about documentation, because I think that's like a pretty easy pitfall for most providers, including myself. I've been in practice 3 years now, and it's still a pitfall for me some days. And some weeks I'm really good at it, and some weeks I'm not very good at it. So it is hard to do. I think that if somebody tells you that they have no problem documenting, they never have issues documenting, they either have like a really good system where they have time throughout the day allotted for that, like admin time throughout the day, maybe 30 minutes before lunch, 30 minutes after lunch every day. So they have a longer lunch break, not usually designated to lunch, but usually designated to time where they have more time to go through documents. So they're not spending this time after hours or after clinic. Or their last patient isn't getting scheduled at 4:50 and your clinic closes at 5. That's just also setting you up for having to work after hours almost every single time. So really focus on finding a company when you're interviewing that respects having admin time, that wants you to be successful, that doesn't want you there late at night, that doesn't want you spending hours afterwards documenting because you're already working hard during the day. So finding a balance is hard, and it's also hard to find that type of clinic. You'll know right away if it's not that type of clinic. You'll ask about admin time. They're going to say, well, we don't really have a lot of admin time. It's a revenue-based clinic. Or they'll say, yeah, you get like 3 hours of admin time and you can choose when you want it. Or they'll say, yeah, you just like work an hour less a day. So you stop seeing patients at 4 in anticipation that you have an hour to do your admin time. I would be very wary of that, because just be careful. Those types of clinics usually are high revenue focused, meaning that they have you scheduled to see patients all day. Usually their no-show policy is like very poor, that it's like 15 minutes into a 20-minute visit, if they show up, that you're still required to see that patient. Yeah, their focus is on revenue. You'll know that this is not maybe an organization that cares if you're burnt out, or cares if you're spending a lot of extra time after hours. So just be mindful of that one when you're interviewing. Now, in your onboarding phase, I would try to perfect your documentation. So use your EHR to your advantage, especially when you're getting your EHR training. Ask, hey, are there a load of preset dot phrases that I can utilize that other providers have? Or can I copy the previous dot phrases from another provider and modify them myself? Most of the time, they're going to be able to help you accommodate that. Or during your onboarding time, on days where you have less workload, create more dot phrases at the beginning. Or I would even recommend having a whole PDF file or a whole Word document of all the dot phrases you've ever wanted to have. I find that, sometimes you use dot phrases, sometimes you don't, but it definitely comes into handy with documentation. Or if you're like in urgent care and you're constantly seeing the same thing over and over again, have a dot phrase or have a template so you're not typing out the same thing over and over. That's a waste of your time. The less time you spend documenting, the more time you have for other things. So dot phrases can be very helpful. Don't become a dot phrase provider, though, where you only use dot phrases. You have to modify the dot phrases. You have to come up with a plan, and you have to write your plan out for yourself, because that's really how things get faster. So between the first visit and the second visit, you have your plan. It's really well organized. It's concise and it makes sense. And it's not just like a random dot phrase that really doesn't have a lot of substance to it. So that will help you the second and third time around. Also, you want to utilize templates. So templates are hit or miss. It kind of depends on your EHR. So a template is, for example, somebody comes in for a UTI. You already kind of have a template set up that's focused more towards the problem visit. Or an upper respiratory infection, you have a template with just like a limited ROS and a limited physical exam. Also, that's like templates are great for things like, well, women's exams, that you're doing a PAP or a breast exam, and that's a small template for that. Or you're doing just a physical for school. Like you can create all type of templates. I would say limit it. You don't need to go crazy at the beginning creating a bunch of templates. I find that I personally don't use them as much as I wished. I mean, I use some of them more than others. If your EHR is really good, you don't really have to do that, but it can definitely be helpful to create that, and you can use them. Sometimes you can even insert your previous note from beforehand, but be very careful when you do that because you have to change you have to change your HPI and you have to change everything, but at least that's pushed forward into a new note, especially if your patient's really sick or has multiple comorbidities and is really complicated. That can be very helpful. So work on documentation, but don't fall into the pitfalls of spending too much time documenting. And I think that's normal for providers to want to do. You're like seeing patients, you're getting really overwhelmed, you want to think about what your plan is, but in reality, write down your plan, keep it brief, have some organization to your notes, have all the information you need in there, but don't over document. It doesn't have to be like a school soap note that you do. And you definitely don't want to document too little. So kind of work on perfecting that throughout the first couple of weeks. If you have to, sit down with your mentor and say, hey, what do you think about my notes here? What do you think I'm over documenting? Do you think there's something I can do to improve my time so I'm more efficient in my notes? So have that meeting with your mentor. I think that can be helpful as well. Or go to somebody that has really good time management and try to understand how they are utilizing their time so that they are successful. Now, keep in mind, you're going to be slower because you don't know your patients. Your team doesn't know your patients and your team is new. So take this with a grain of salt, but definitely focus on trying to perfect this portion of your of being a provider. So some other tips that I think can be helpful when it comes to documentation. Try not to take your documentation home. So try to close your clinical notes before you leave the building. Now, if you're somebody that just doesn't work, you want to beat traffic or you want to get home and you'd rather do it in your own space, do that. But then when you're home, don't be watching, multitasking. Really sit down and focus and get your notes done right away because you don't want to have those open. You don't want to have a big long line of notes hanging over your head that can get you into trouble later on. And you want to do it when it's fresh in your mind as well. So when we say things that I've found helpful documenting wise, so you're going to see a whole spectrum of things. Some providers will sit down the day before, open all their notes, pre-chart all their notes so that they're ready for the next day. I personally don't find that helpful. I personally don't want to spend an hour and a half at nighttime on my own time pre-charting for the next day when I don't even know if those patients are going to show up. I personally don't do that, and I personally don't find that helpful. I do know a handful of providers that do that. I don't think it's very useful, but that's just me. Now, I am a fan of pre-charting before you see the patient. So what I mean by that is that your medical assistant starting the visit, they're working them up. If they're here for like a lab follow-up or something easy, I'm going to pop in my review of systems and my physical exam so I can easily change that during the exam or afterwards. I'm going to have a very concise HPI. You bring my laptop into the room. I'm going to chart my HPI while I'm in there, and I am going to change any physical exams that I need. I like to order everything right in front of the patient so that they understand the plan where I'm like, okay, these are what we're ordering. This is, your screening exams that we need to get done. These are the vaccines you're due for. I like to do that to keep myself organized, but I also find that it really helps the patient so they're aware of what they need to do as well. I don't always do it in front of the patient, but most of the time, if it's simple enough, I'll do it as I go because that's just one thing less I have to do when I get out of the room. Now, some people will say, well, Megan, you're basically like being rude by charting in front of the patient. You have to. If you want to be successful in this type of industry in the sense that you're not bringing too much work home, I think it is helpful to document in the room. And I think patients nowadays are more used to seeing it like a computer or some type of computer screen. Now, obviously, be mindful of it. Do not have your computer or your laptop in front of your face while you're talking to the patient. Use it sparingly, have it there as a reference, and it can be helpful because you can say, okay, let's look up what your last cholesterol panel is. Let's see how things compared, or your A1C was this 3 months ago. This is what it is now. I think it's helpful to have in there. I think it's good for your patient. You can use it to pull up imaging, whatever you need your computer or laptop to be there for. I think it's helpful. So also use that time to document what you can, but don't be rude. But you have to, I think finding that balance is going to be helpful for you afterwards. So as soon as you leave that patient room, before you go to the next patient, try to close the note or get as much information in there as possible. Like get your orders in, get your coding in, and almost have it all ready to go, except for, maybe you just can't close it just yet because they're waiting for something to happen. But try as much as possible to close that note before you go to your next patient. I think it's really hard to do that, but if you can get into the habit of doing that, I think that will only be helpful for you, or finish as much of the note as possible. So at the end of the day, you're really just going through and saying, okay, close, okay, close, okay, close. So that can be helpful as well. Now, some people don't like to chart in front of their patients, or they like to wait until the end of the day. I don't think you need to wait until you have labs back. I don't think you need to wait until you get your imaging back. Definitely don't do that. Your notes are going to be open for forever. And really, your note is supposed to reflect your clinical judgment right then and there when you're seeing the patient. So you'll have opportunities to open a new document if you need to later on, but try as much as possible to be consistent, close your notes, and then create a summary and a plan for yourself. So that's some of the most helpful things as a new grad, because if you can create a plan and have it at the end of each note, that is going to help you 3 months from now when you see that patient. You're not going to be spending 5 to 10 minutes looking up their previous history. Also, something that can be helpful is utilize your team. You can delegate. So if you have an ER follow-up and you have those notes, go ahead and have your nurse start the documentation for you and really put in all that pertinent information. You're still going to want to review the notes and review the documents, but that's one last piece that you have to actually physically document. So work with your team, find out what works for you, look at your other colleagues, see what they find helpful, talk to your mentor. This is something that you're going to be perfecting for years. So don't beat yourself up if it's not working, but definitely if you're seeing yourself going down a path where you're not liking what you're seeing, or you're spending a lot of time after clinic hours documenting, try to really figure out why that is and see if there's ways that you can improve. Also, most of the time, if you go to your employer or your EHR individual, you can say, hey, I'm really having a hard time with this. I'm spending a lot of time outside of clinic. What are some tips that others are utilizing that maybe I don't know about? Or maybe you don't know that you can use a template. Try out a template, try things, because you need to be happy at the end of the day. I think that the providers with the less amount of burnout, they're going to be providers for a longer period of time. So really do your best to cut down the amount of work that you're doing after hours. Find an organization that cares about this and utilize your admin time as well. So I hope you found this video helpful. There's going to be more to come on To Me Time episodes, but thanks so much for tuning in. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I also have my podcast portion coming out very soon, so that you're going to be able to listen to these on your commute or just listen. I know it's hard sometimes on YouTube, but this is coming. So thanks so much for being patient. And yet again, thanks so much for tuning in to Me Time. See you next time.